as promised, video part 2. So the other part of this, kind of a general theme of this chapter, is also with increasing freedom and like privileges comes increasing responsibility. So that kind of adage of to whom much is given, much is expected. As teenagers are given more freedom, autonomy, and control in their lives, they're also expected perhaps to contribute more. So I'm sure that this was something you experienced growing up. So as you maybe got your license and had some time with the car, or got your own car, there were some expectations of, well, now that you're driving, oh, now you're going to pay for your insurance, or oh, now you're gonna have to take your brother or sister to and from practice, or something like that. And so similarly, if you're going to be required to vote, again, there's not a regulation to this, but this is kind of a rule of thumb that should be hopefully communicated to teenagers. So if you're approaching the age at which you're able to vote and take a part in our kind of governmental society, you also should perhaps be gaining more knowledge of these issues. You might want to get more involved in some political issues. Be aware. I wouldn't want my kids to be voting without teaching them and showing them how to educate themselves on these issues. And so again, the whole idea is that we need a little bit more training in this. There's also different changes that the book talks about. So there's these interpersonal changes. So parents are kind of adjusting, and teachers and families are adjusting to you or the teen being older. And so some of that's like literally getting moved up to the majors from the kids' table. Sometimes that's, again, just like letting you be included in more adult-like conversations, letting them being interested in what you have to say. There's political changes, economic, where you now control much more of your money, and all of that. Let's see, I'm just looking at the slides, see what else I want to talk about. I gave you guys some nice slides on the young voter, and I'm really interested in how that young adult demographic votes, so the 18 to like 24, how much they vote, and then also kind of that young adult demographic as a function of ethnicity. So how are, minority and majority young voters voting, and what are some of their trends? So you can see some of that. So millennials did have a nice turnout for the election in 2016. And it did increase amongst racial groups too, so that was a positive. Some positive things going on. Not surprisingly, there's a lot of heated feelings about this election, and continue probably to be. Here's the again, kind of that whole, to whom much is given, much is expected. So now, if you can work, again, aside from certain jobs, maybe under the table jobs, or jobs for whatever reason in ice cream shops, you can seemingly work there at like the age of 12 or 13 or something. But most jobs, like in order to actually get a job, you need to be 16. And if you're not 16, then there are some special like modifications for you, because there's some laws about working, and then we'll talk about that in a later chapter. But also, you're expected to pay taxes too on that money. So it's not like babysitting for your neighbors and it's under the table anymore. So what else? Let's see. One term that's good to know is something like a status offense. So there's some, it's not really called a crime. There's certain things like running away from home. You could actually end up in juvenile detention for that. You can't be in juvenile detention when you're 18 or older. Now you're an adult and you can't be tried or be labeled with a status offense. The other one, another good one, is like example of something called truancy, where you're not going to school. So sometimes parents have some culpability on that issue too. Parents could be in trouble, but typically it falls onto the student who, why are you not going to school? You may, again, have some legal ramifications of that if you're not. And, when you blend in chapter 2 and 3, and I alluded to it in the video before about trying adolescence as adults, that's a really, really interesting point. And it's really hard to prove that someone is, completely understanding of the consequences, or what factors were playing into their role, and how that would have differed if they were, 6 or 7 years older. Kids, we know, develop at really different ages. From a maturity standpoint, girls tend to be more mature than males on an average, not just with puberty, but on average in many areas, kind of emotional development and even cognitive, on average like 1 to 2 years ahead of males. So where's the, I think some of these cases are really important to consider. And again, this research in adolescent development and adolescent psychology has really contributed to changing some public policies on these issues. So in this slide, this does answer one of the quiz questions. So the whole idea of like what's socialization. So one thing is teaching self-regulation. So one hard thing is sometimes controlling your frustration tolerance. Again, the school is trying to model some good behaviors of what do you do when you're getting frustrated. So kind of regulating yourself, being able to kind of control yourself, not engaging in violent behavior to resolve a conflict. That some people get that mentality and that idea more quickly than others. Again, the idea of role preparation, now some schools do it better than others. So perhaps, teaching them more about balancing your online banking, or maybe it's about, cooking and cleaning. Maybe it's about negotiating relationships. But the whole idea of marriage, the gender role, ethnic identity, things like that. Like there's some interesting things that are happening at schools on that, and also helping people cultivate sources of meaning and what do they want to do. That's important. So a lot of these other topics like identity, autonomy, and stuff feed into this and interact with this. And again, we'll talk about those in more detail. I think for the most part, there's some other things that happen somewhat naturally and then sometimes more purposefully, but other ways, like part of this process is not only hard for kids, but it can be hard for parents. So one thing that we're trying to do is to socialize them and have them gain some independence. So one of the first ways that happens is something called extrusion, and it sounds really extreme, and it's not as extreme as it sounds, but it's kind of those slow ways in which, for a while, for the first couple years of life, depending on where a kid is. So imagine maybe a family where one parent stays home, the kid maybe goes to preschool for a few hours. That might be one of the first examples of extrusion, or just getting a babysitter or things like that. But as you're entering the realm of extrusion in the area of like early adolescence, it's things like maybe going away to camp or sleeping over at someone's house or going away for the summer or doing something a little bit bigger. Having some experimentation with being away from parents. And that also links a little bit to developing your own sense of like opinions outside from them, and developing your own sense of self. Sometimes parents and kids, some families are more vulnerable to this than others, are really enmeshed. So like what mom or dad believes is so enmeshed with what the kid does, or they're always together. And right now that sounds kind of good. I like hanging out with my kids, but it's a process to kind of let them go and gain independence. That's a normative skill that they need to develop a little bit, or it's going to be hard if like you're the only kid who you're crying your eyes out on the 8th grade trip to Washington, D.C. If you can't have some separation from that, that's atypical. That might be a problem. So part of it is this like slightly challenged process of trying to negotiate some independence and separation. Not to say that means you have to be emotionally separated, but being able to tolerate some physical and some emotional separation. Also, some families are going to be much more gender neutral, or gender, gender fair, I don't know. But there's a phenomenon that tends to happen in a lot of families where like males go with the dads or the paternal figures, and girls go with the moms, and maybe it's passing on information from one generation to another, or their shared interests. My husband and I constantly literally have this fight every year. He goes on this trip. He likes the Ohio State Buckeyes. Every year his friends go and rent an RV that's pretty expensive, and they drive to an away game, and they hang out all weekend. And Chris made a comment like a couple years ago and said, I just can't wait until Graham's old enough to go. And as any of you know me, I was kind of like, well, why couldn't Lainey go on this trip? And so we kind of got in this argument about that, and like he'll argue that like, hey, some things should be guy things and that should be protected. And I was kind of like, well, if she wants to go, this might be like setting her on this path or socializing her to think, only guys watch football and only guys do things like that. So maybe her going and having a good time could like set into motion, like a change or a closeness that they might have or something. So anyway, think on that. What would you do? Have a conversation with your romantic other. So that's kind of that. So can argue about that. There's a couple different issues. Let me see. So again, we clearly have a more discontinuous transition as opposed to continuous. And I think there's some solutions that have been thought about, like having more internships and apprentice models. And again, having good role models, whether at work. I'll be talking about that later in later chapters, that I think what a lot of teenagers where they work tend to be really mal-preparing kids for the work that they're going to be likely doing later. So if you think about maybe a more traditional, like college-bound high schooler, the type of job they get might be something really manual and rote and boring, and certainly not using the skills that they're learning at school. And so if you think about, oh, the dogs are here, mending. Bye. My dad's here. Hi, Dad. He's just getting back from fly fishing. Welcome to my world. Bye.